The rancher's bride vanished on their wedding night without a trace. The morning of her wedding, Ellie Marsh stood before a cracked mirror in the back room of the Millers Creek Church and tried to convince herself that fear and love could not possibly feel the same way inside a person's chest. Her hands trembled as she pinned the last few curls into place, and outside the small window she could hear the wagons arriving, the soft murmur of townsfolk gathering, the sound of a life about to change forever. She was 23 years old, an orphan raised in a strict boarding house in St. Louis, and she had crossed nearly 1,000 miles by train and stagecoach to marry a rancher named Thomas Cole, a man she had exchanged letters with for 8 months, but had only met 3 days before this morning. She did not know yet that by nightfall she would vanish from that ranch without a trace, and that the man waiting for her at the altar would spend the next 2 years believing she had simply run away and left him standing there with a shattered heart and a house too quiet to bear. If you have ever loved someone and then lost them without an answer, without a goodbye, without even the mercy of knowing why, stay with me tonight, because this story is about to show you that sometimes the truth takes years to find its way home, and sometimes love waits far longer than anyone thought a heart could hold on. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, because stories like this one deserve to be shared with people who still believe in second chances. Thomas Cole was a quiet man, the kind who said little and worked hard. A widower's son who had buried both his parents before he turned 20 and built his ranch ups out of nothing but stubbornness and long hours. He had written to Ellie after a friend in town suggested the matchmaking service, half convinced nothing would come of it, until her first letter arrived. She wrote about small things, about the sound of rain on tin roofs, about a book of poems she kept hidden beneath her pillow at the boarding house, about wanting a life with quiet mornings and someone who would simply stay. Something about her honesty cracked open a part of Thomas that had been closed since his mother passed, and by the time Ellie stepped off the stagecoach into Millers Creek 3 days before the wedding, he was already halfway in love with a woman he barely knew. She was small and fair, with careful eyes that seemed to search every face for danger before they allowed themselves to soften. Thomas noticed that carefulness right away, the way she flinched slightly at loud sounds, the way her gaze would drift toward the road as though she expected someone to come looking for her. He did not push. He simply let her settle, let her walk the land at her own pace, let her sit quietly on the porch in the evenings without demanding conversation she was not ready to give. "You seem like a man who understands waiting," Ellie told him the night before their wedding, as they sat together under a sky thick with stars. "Guess I've had plenty of practice," Thomas said. "This ranch taught me that most good things take their time showing up." Ellie smiled at that, but there was something behind her eyes that night, something Thomas would spend the next 2 years trying to understand, a flicker of fear that passed so quickly he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. The wedding itself was small but warm, held in the little church with Ruth Alden, the preacher's wife, standing as witness, and half the town crowded into the pews because weddings were rare and precious things in a place like Millers Creek. Ellie wore a simple ivory dress that had belonged to her mother, one of the only things she had left of a family she barely remembered. And when she said her vows, her voice was steady and sure, filled with a hope that made Thomas believe, for the first time in years, that his lonely life was finally about to change. They returned to the ranch that evening for a quiet supper Ruth had helped prepare, laughter and warmth filling the little house for the first time in longer than Thomas could remember. Ellie retired early, tired from the long day, and Thomas stayed up finishing chores in the barn, humming to himself, a man who had not felt this kind of peace in years. When he came inside near midnight, the house was silent, too silent. The bedroom door stood open, the lamp still burning low, but Ellie was gone. Her small trunk remained exactly where it had been placed that morning. Her wedding dress hung carefully over the chair, but she herself, along with the plain traveling coat she had worn on her journey west, had vanished into the darkness as if she had never been there at all. Thomas searched the property until dawn, calling her name into a night that gave him nothing back but the wind. He rode into town, woke the sheriff, organized search parties that combed the creek beds and the fields for 3 days straight. But there was no trace of her, no footprints beyond the edge of the yard, no sign of struggle, nothing but an empty space where his new wife had been. The town buzzed with theories. Some said she had gotten cold feet and run off with money from a hidden lover. Some said she must have wandered off and fallen somewhere in the dark, though no body was ever found despite every search. Thomas's own aunt, sharp-tongued Edith, told him plainly that he was better off forgetting a woman who could vanish like smoke on her own wedding night. But Thomas could not forget the way Ellie had looked at him under the stars the night before. The honesty in her voice, the hope in her eyes. Whatever had happened, he did not believe, not for one single moment, that she had chosen to leave him. He kept her trunk exactly where it was. He kept the wedding dress hanging on that same chair for 2 long years, though dust gathered on its careful stitching and moths found their way into the fabric despite his best efforts to protect it. The house grew quieter with each passing season, and Thomas grew quieter along with it, a man who worked his land from dawn until exhaustion, simply so his mind would have no room left to wonder what had become of the woman he loved. What Thomas did not know, could not have known, was the truth that had pulled Ellie out into that dark night. Ellie had not run from her marriage. She had run from a man named Silas Grant, a cruel figure from her past in St. Louis who had discovered, through a careless letter she had once sent to a friend, exactly where she had gone and exactly who she had married. Silas was not a stranger to Ellie. He was the man who had controlled her life for 3 years before her escape west, a man who had told the boarding house she owed him a debt her late father had left behind, a debt he used to keep her trapped in fear and obedience long after any honest debt would have been settled. When Ellie finally fled St. Louis for the mail-order bride service, she believed she had escaped him for good. She had not. On her wedding night, while Thomas finished his chores in the barn, a note had been slipped beneath the bedroom window. Carried by a boy, Silas had paid a few coins to deliver it quietly. The note said simply that if Ellie did not come outside within the hour, alone, Silas would walk straight into that wedding supper and tell every soul in Miller's Creek exactly what kind of woman Thomas Cole had married, twisting old truths into something ugly and unforgivable, ruining not only her name but Thomas's, standing in the only community he had ever called home. Terrified and utterly certain that her silence was the only way to protect the man she had already come to love in those short 3 days, Ellie slipped out into the darkness to face Silas alone. She believed she could reason with him, could offer to leave quietly if it meant Thomas's life and reputation remained untouched by scandal that was never truly hers to carry. But Silas did not want reason. He wanted control, and when Ellie refused to return to St. Louis with him, he forced her onto a waiting wagon in the night, hauling her hundreds of miles away to a small settlement in Colorado, where he kept her isolated, cut off from any means of writing home, watched constantly so she could never send word to Thomas or anyone else who might come looking. For 2 long years, Ellie lived under Silas's control, working in a laundry he owned. Every letter she tried to write intercepted and destroyed before it ever left the building. She thought of Thomas every single day, the warmth in his voice, the safety she had felt on that porch beneath the stars, and she held onto a single fragile hope that someday, somehow, she would find her way back to him. Her chance finally came when Silas, growing careless in his certainty that she had given up all hope of escape, allowed her to run errands into town unsupervised. Ellie used those small moments of freedom carefully, saving what coins she could, memorizing the schedule of the stagecoach that passed through twice a month, until finally, on a cold morning in early spring, she slipped away for good, boarding that stagecoach with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart pounding with equal parts terror and desperate hope. The journey back to Miller's Creek took nearly 3 weeks, crossing half-frozen rivers and wading through delays that nearly broke what little courage she had left. She had no money for proper lodging, sometimes sleeping in stagecoach stations, sometimes going without meals to save what few coins remained for the next leg of the journey. But every mile brought her closer to the only place that had ever truly felt like home, and she would not let herself stop, not even when exhaustion and fear threatened to convince her that Thomas had surely moved on, had surely remarried, had surely stopped believing in a wife who disappeared without so much as a word. She was wrong about that. When Ellie finally stepped down from the stagecoach into Miller's Creek on a quiet spring evening, thinner than she had been, her hair longer and touched with a weariness 2 hard years leaves on a person, she stood frozen at the edge of town, uncertain if she still had the right to walk toward that ranch at all. Ruth Alden was the first to recognize her, dropping a basket of mending right there in the street, rushing forward with tears streaming down her face. Certain for a moment she was seeing a ghost. "Ellie Cole," Ruth whispered, pulling her into an embrace so tight it nearly stole what little breath Ellie had left. "Sweet heaven above, it's really you." Word reached Thomas within the hour, carried by a young boy who ran the entire distance from town to the ranch without stopping, breathless as he delivered the news that would change everything. Thomas was mending fence when the boy arrived, and when he heard the words, his hands went still, the hammer slipping from his fingers into the dirt. He rode into town faster than he had ridden in 2 long years, his heart pounding with a fear that this could somehow be a cruel mistake, that he would arrive to find it was not truly her, that his hope would be crushed one more time. But when he came around the corner near Ruth's small shop and saw her standing there, thin and tired but unmistakably achingly real, Thomas nearly fell from his horse in his hurry to reach her. "Ellie," he said, his voice breaking on the single word. "I never left you," she said, tears spilling freely down her face as she took a trembling step toward him. "Thomas, I swear before God, I never wanted to leave. I was taken. I have spent 2 years trying to find my way back to you." Thomas closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms as though he might never let go again. And for a long moment, neither of them said another word because none were needed. He simply held her, breathing in the fact that she was real, that she was warm, that she was truly there in his arms after 2 years of empty silence and unanswered prayers. That evening, sitting together in the ranch house that had stood quiet and waiting for so long, Ellie told him everything. She told him about Silas, about the threats, about the choice she made that night to protect Thomas's name and safety, even at the cost of her own freedom. She told him about the laundry, about the intercepted letters, about the small stolen freedoms that finally, after 2 long years, let her slip away and begin the long journey home. Thomas listened without interrupting, his jaw tight with a quiet fury toward a man he had never met, and when she finished, he took her hands gently in his own. "You gave up 2 years of your life to protect me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I kept your dress hanging on that chair the whole time, Ellie. I never once believed you left me by choice. Something in my heart simply would not let me believe it." "You waited," Ellie whispered, disbelief and gratitude mingling in her voice. 2 whole years? And you waited?" "I would have waited 20 more if that's what it took," Thomas said. "You are my wife." That vow did not have an expiration on it, storm or silence or distance be damned. The sheriff was notified of Silas Grant's crimes that same week, and word eventually came that he had been arrested trying to control another vulnerable woman in a different territory, his cruelty finally catching up to the consequences it had long deserved. Ellie testified through letters sent carefully with the help of the local circuit judge, and in time, justice found him in a way it had been far too slow to find him before. As for Ellie and Thomas, they did not simply return to the life they had planned 2 years earlier. They built something even sturdier from the wreckage of what had been stolen from them, a bond tempered by loss and tested by time, a love that had survived silence and fear and thousands of miles of uncertainty and come out unbroken on the other side. The wedding dress that had hung on that chair for 2 long years was finally packed carefully away, not out of forgetting, but out of a promise that its waiting had finally, truly ended. In its place, Ellie hung simple curtains. She sewed herself for the bedroom window, a small, quiet symbol that this house was no longer a place of waiting and empty rooms, but a home once again filled with warmth and laughter and the slow, steady rebuilding of a life 2 people had refused to let go of. A little more than a year later, on a warm summer evening, Ruth Alden stood on that same porch holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blue blanket, laughing as she told anyone who would listen that Miller's Creek had never seen a braver bride nor a more patient rancher, and that their daughter, born into a home finally free of fear and silence, was living proof that love does not give up, even when the whole world seems determined to keep 2 hearts apart. Thomas would often stand at the fence line in the evenings, his daughter perched on his shoulders just as he had once imagined doing during those long, lonely years of waiting, Ellie beside him with her hand resting gently in his, and he would think back to that empty bedroom on his wedding night, the fear that had nearly swallowed him whole, and he would feel nothing but gratitude that he had trusted his heart instead of the easy explanations the world had offered him. Some loves, he had learned, are simply worth the waiting, no matter how long the silence stretches, no matter how impossible the distance seems. If this story moved you tonight, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you believe, like Thomas did, that true love is always worth waiting for. Stories like Ellie and Thomas remind us that even the darkest silence can eventually lead back home and that the family we are meant to have will always find its way back to us in the end. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there are so many more hearts out there still finding their way back to love.